I'm from Moscow. This week, fact versus fiction on the Russian plane crash, the forgotten dictatorship, Eritrea, and an Afghan girl who was saved from a child marriage by rapping. You're in the now. Don't jump to conclusions, Moscow urged about the Russian plane crash, but it didn't work. They jumped.
I think there is a possibility that there was a bomb on board, and we're taking that very seriously.
Intelligence and information we had that gave us the concern that it was more likely than not it was a terrorist bomb.
The media have feelings too.
There is a definite feeling it was an explosive device planted in the luggage or somewhere on the plane.
An explosive device on the plane.
A Russian plane may well have been brought down by an explosive device.
Russia stopped all passenger flights to Egypt on the orders of the country's anti-terrorism committee, following the same move by some European countries and air carriers. So yes, it may have been a bomb. We don't know yet. But if so, isn't it the right time to unite against terror? To call and say, hey, we support you. Let's bomb ISIS out together. Naive, right? It's not just about bombs in Syria. It's also about words, talking and agreeing on something, anything at this point. Moscow is ready to talk to the Free Syrian Army and even help them militarily. But what's on the other side? Joining us in the now is Jacques Millard, member of the National Assembly of France. He represents the UMP party, of course, of former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask you, you've been speaking a lot about this in the French media. What's your assessment of what's happening right now in Syria?
Well, of course, in Syria, you know, you have to gather all around the table and follow a solution. That means you cannot say, I exclude this country or the other one. We need to have all opponents around the table to find a solution. If there isn't a political will to achieve, first of all, the combat toward Islamic states and so-called Al-Qaeda people like Al-Nusra, and if we say we don't want a Bashar, there is no way to find a solution. So this is why I've always been for, you know, to take into account Bashar government, because he's part of the solution. And I regret that some states say we don't want of him. We are going to, you know, get rid of him. This is the best way not to find a solution. And I regret that some states in the region had the same position against Iran. Of course, this has changed a bit. But as you've seen in Vienna, there are still a lot of, let's say, you know, minds or back thoughts on the presence of Iran. Because you have, in fact, a war which is a civil war, but it is also a war by proxy between, you know, countries which dislike each other in the region.
It would seem that a lot of French and many Europeans think that it is very black and white, that this is about a dictator and some heroes trying to save Syria and villains propping him up. Do Europeans evaluate the deeper geopolitical consequences of this conflict?
I think that you have to make a difference between, let's say, public opinion and also, if I take the case of France, the MP's position on this Syria conflict, and you will be very surprised to see that even in the presidential majority, that means people from the left, a lot who are in favor to find a solution with Bashar and then let the Syrians decide what will be their future, what will be their government.
It's taken a long time, though. This war in its 5th year, we've had your president, the British leader, Barack Obama, many world leaders for years saying that Assad must go. So why is this the political face of this crisis?
I think the mistake which has been made is a question of posture, you know, a question of morality. You don't follow let's say, a diplomatic position only on morality. Morality, if you say, I don't want to speak to this one because it's a criminal, because, you know, all, let's say, chief of states have something to be reproached. So I think that there is a saying in France, human rights, we are all together, we are all for human rights, but it doesn't explain the world. So I think that the purpose of diplomacy is also to speak, taking account realities with those people we don't like.
Russian jets in the skies, plus possible U.S. boots on the ground. Is this conflict going in the wrong direction, do you think?
Well, this is nothing new that the U.S. have been involved. You know, they just announced that they are sending 50 personnel on the ground to as advisor. This is no scoop. In fact, the U.S. have been involved for long ago, and they are not the only one. So I have the feeling that there should be an agreement between the United States and the rest of the, let's say, belligerents and the rest of the people who are underground. The Russians themselves have said that they were bombing the Islamic State or al-Nusra and helping the Damas regime. This is a question that we have to face. If we want to stop peace, we need to have all opponents around the table and discuss. This is the only way to find a solution. But unfortunately, you know, there are behind this war, let's say, influence by other states who don't want. There is, of course, we know, opposition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And there is also opposition, but which is not very, which is strong, between Shia and Sunnis. So this is where we have to calm down things. If we believe in the Western world, in France, that in fact the Free Syrian Army is a very active, you know, opposition on the ground, and they are so-called moderate, it doesn't exist anymore. In fact, underground, against the regime of Bashar, we have the Islamic State and we have Al-Qaeda through al-Nusra. So this is a reality. And I think that, as I said to our government, the only place where you find free Syrian army, this is in the saloon of the Intercontinental hotels, either in London, Paris, or elsewhere.
All right, French MP Jacques Millard, thank you so much for being in the Now. The Russian internet is not free, says a U.S.-funded think tank. It's called Freedom House, a very impartial, independent, democratic organization, I'm sure. So here's Russia, in the same club with Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, which arrest and flog bloggers, not to mention chop off people's heads. And it's worse than Turkey. Yes, the country that blocked Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube on different occasions. But Russia is much worse. The Kremlin has blocked more than 10,000 sites, almost half of which contain drug-related content, child pornography websites, extremist websites, and calls for protest. How dare they? It's not like you can get permits to protest in the tens of thousands here in the motherland. I have to say, people controlling the Russian internet aren't doing a great job. Don't tell them. But we found some pretty harsh stuff out there, like this. Yeah, it's pretty rough online. And people can say whatever they want.
Убийственной политикой, которую ведет путинский режим.
В связи с этим происходят войны, мы не только воруем, мы еще и убиваем.
Это все может привести только к морям крови этого режима, который будет хвататься за власть всеми способами.
Even if it's not true. Now that's freedom. BBC got an exclusive look behind the scenes at NATO headquarters.
The BBC was given rare access to the nerve center from where they can see every aircraft flying.
But the Hawks are watching the Hawks, literally tuned in to RT's hit show, not even bothering to turn it off for the cameras. Well, that's awkward. Up to 80% of marriages in Afghanistan are forced or underage. One young Afghan girl escaped a child marriage by rapping. She told us how music changed her life and shared her greatest dream.
There were two different times that my family tried to have me married. The first time I was 10 years old, and the second time was almost 2 years ago. In my country, selling girls is not unusual. Had so many emotions and thoughts about the way women are treated in Iran and Afghanistan. So I tried rap. My mother called me and she said, it was good. She didn't say, wow, you're singing about women's rights. But for me, it was the biggest change in my life. I love living here right now because I can study, I can think about my future. When I'm done with all my study, I will go back to my country. My dream of ending child marriage feels like possible.
What do an ISIS terrorist and a Saudi prince have in common? Their drug of choice. Coming up, we take a look at so-called jihad meth. Stay in the now. There's a drug boom in the Middle East, and some countries are cashing in on the amphetamine Captagon, otherwise known as jihad meth.
Security forces in Lebanon interrogated a Saudi prince on charges of carrying 24 bags and 8 suitcases full of narcotics.
Huge drug bust shines a very bright spotlight on one of the little-known drivers fueling the Syrian civil war. The drug is an amphetamine called Captagon.
Brussels has found an original solution for the refugee crisis. More camps, migrant quotas, resettlement plans? Nope. It might grant the poorest countries people flee from with huge sums of money, like Eritrea, which it plans to fund with more than $230 million. But that would be $230 million more, because Eritrea has already received almost $4.5 million of financial aid this year from other global organizations. The money is flowing in, but Eritreans continue to flow out. The refugees, the number of them, is not going down. The country tops the world's most censored. Some call it the North Korea of Africa. No other parties except the ruling one. No presidential elections for 20 years. There's no access for foreign media and no human rights groups. Joining me in the now is Dr. Daniel R. Mekonnen, former provincial court judge in Eritrea. Thank you so much for being with us. He's joining us from Geneva at the moment. Government-controlled internet and mobile communication, almost no cell phones, political prisoners. That's not only Eritrea, but North Korea, Saudi Arabia as well. However, we're seeing more people flee as refugees from Africa. Why?
Well, I mean, if I have to speak in terms of the experience in Eritrea, I think the factors, the reasons by which people are fleeing the country are very obvious. There is a severe situation of political repression, including persecution of religious rights in Eritrea, by which reason people are fleeing the country. Perhaps maybe another very important reason is the government's policy of indefinite conscription, military conscription, which affects the majority of the able-bodied of the Eritrean society. And because of all reasons, we have one of the leading figures of refugees throughout the world.
You say one of the leading figures. Eritrea, of course, also receives a lot of aid from national, international organizations and could be getting another big chunk of aid from Brussels. Obviously, people are still fleeing. We're not seeing this money go to where it should be going. That would be the assumption. Why is that the case? The money's coming in, but people are still flowing out.
That's very problematic. The European Union is sending right now, or proposing to send, huge amount of money in the name of development cooperation. We know for a fact that this has not worked in the past, and I don't believe it will work at this moment in time, and I don't also believe it will work even in the future. Problem is, they are not trying to address the root cause of the problem of the political crisis in Eritrea. Instead, they are looking into the symptoms of the problem or of the political situation in Eritrea. Sending money is not a solution. They have to deal with the main problems which have caused this situation of deep political crisis in Eritrea, at the center of which lies the unprecedented or very sad state of human rights violations. With all these problems, in my view, if the European Union decides finally to send huge amount of money in the name of development cooperation, of course, it's not going to solve the problem. In fact, by doing so, I feel that they are contradicting their own principles, the principles which are enshrined in the founding documents of the European Union, such as the Treaty of Lisbon and the Cotonou Agreement, which governs any development cooperation with the European Union and the rest of the developing world. So by contradicting all these principles, they are not sending a good message, and that's why we have been calling time and again for the European Union to revise its policy with regard to Eritrea, because it has not worked in the past and it's not working at present as well.
We hear so much talk about human rights coming out of Brussels, and you're touching on this double standard a bit. Let's talk a little bit more about it. Why do we hear so little about the repression in Eritrea when you say it's so obvious from the Europeans? Do they not see it?
I mean, maybe 4 or 5 years back, we could have said people were not hearing well about the situation of human rights in Eritrea. I believe it has changed now. I will give you a very recent example, which is the report of the United Nations mandated Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Eritrea, which was released in in June of this year. The report depicts a very sad state of human rights in Eritrea. In fact, the commissioners say some of the violations that are taking place in Eritrea at this moment in time may even amount to crimes against humanity. And imagine the European Union is trying to engage with a government which is implicated of a possible situation of crimes against humanity. And this is the question we're asking. What's the standard? What are the standards of engagement? What are the terms and conditions by which the European Union is trying to engage the government in Eritrea? If you look into the stories that made up the report of the Commission of Inquiry, you would really, really feel very sad about the situation of human rights in Eritrea. So this again takes us back to the first question you asked previously. On what basis is the European Union trying to engage the Eritrean government when actually we know that the situation of human rights is very bad? What they have to do is, I think, they need to come back again to look deeply into the problem at the ground level, which means without trying to improve the political situation, the political crisis in Eritrea, they will not be able to achieve other objectives such as poverty eradication or poverty reduction, as are done in the name of development aid. So the message I would like to repeat every now and then is the European Union needs to revise its policy towards Eritrea.
Do you ever bring up in your arguments in trying to bring awareness to this issue of the regime that we hear and see a lot of focus about certain regimes on the continent, let's say Syria and President Assad, for instance, and his so-called violations of human rights, and then Eritrea, you find yourself having to fight to bring awareness to those violations. Do you ever bring this double standard up to parties you're trying to convince?
Yes, of course, sometimes you see this instance of double standards, and that's why we are raising this issue whenever we can do so. If we look into the experience in Syria, for example, I would like to focus on the aspects of the conflict which are relevant as we compare the experience in Eritrea. For we all know that Syria is experiencing one of the worst forms of armed violence, civil war, while Eritrea is not experiencing any form of armed conflict. But these are the two top countries which are sending the highest number of refugees to Europe. So the fact that there is no armed conflict in Eritrea does not mean there is peace. In fact, absence of war does not mean peace. And this is the point where the European Union seems to be missing. But somehow it feels that by sending huge amount of money in the name of development cooperation, they may think they can stem the outflow of refugees from Eritrea. But it will not help. They have been doing this since 2007. They repeated the same policy in 2009. It didn't work. And they are preparing to repeat the same policy now again for the third time, at least to say, in 2015. And of course, when you see what they are doing in other contexts, in other political contexts, we don't find it compatible with what they are doing in the experience of Eritrea. And definitely, yes, we can say they are using double standards in different situations which need to be treated by the same standards.
Dr. Daniel R. McConan, Eritrean human rights lawyer based in Geneva, speaking to us from there. Thanks so much for your input. Very interesting, and for being in the now.
Thank you for inviting me.
A million mass march took place in London this week. Hundreds of people took to the streets to protest just about everything. Here's how it turned out.
Who street? Our street! Who street? Our street!
So many protests nowadays, nothing wrong with it, of course, but it seems to me that protesters who actually know what they want might be a little bit more effective. Here's Lori Harfiness with all you need to know.
I passed by here one day and there was a Black Lives Matter protest, and there were like 90 people. Like, you could probably quantitatively, objectively call it 90 people.
Right.
There were 2 black people.
How'd that make you feel?
I didn't know how to feel about that. How are you supposed to feel about that?
I'm tired of all your dissent. Don't you know you cause violence with your First Amendment rights? Have you ever protested?
I'm not much for protesting.
Why not?
Because I don't really see any point behind it. I think it's just a bunch of people being really loud and trying to make a point, but not understanding what point they're making themselves.
I'm just sick of all the protests. The hippies, the commies, the pinkos, you know. That's it! That's it! I'm tired of all your whining! I mean, you're holding the sign.
I am holding the sign. I guess I was convinced without really thinking about what I was getting myself into. But I guess that's what society does, right? We kind of get pushed into these things that we don't really know, but like we kind of stand behind it because it's easy to hold
feels good,
something.
and we want to feel. We want to feel so much. We want to feel. We want to connect. No more protests! No more protests! What have you protested for?
Police brutality, racism, and against abortion.
Have you ever felt racism?
No.
Have you ever felt an abortion?
No.
So why are you protesting these things?
Because I see people who suffer, and I feel empathy towards them, and I support their causes and their rights.
vodka is too good for me. The 5-0, man.
The 5-0. It's all right. It's all right. They can't
It's all right.
harm us.
That's right. It's all right. It's all right. Freedom of speech, baby.
It's right. It's beautiful.
It is beautiful.
All right, let's go. Let's see some ID.
Oh, all right.
That does it for me this week. Thanks for being in the now. If you like what you see, of course, stay in touch with us online throughout the week. You can send your story ideas to Facebook or Twitter. Check us out on YouTube for our best clips. We're also on Vine and Snapchat. I'll see you next week. Till then, it's now or never.